Okay. Well, I know we have about 20 people signed in right now. Looks like we have room for more. I think more people signed up, but I just wanted to go ahead and get started on time, just given the calendar and given that we have a lot to say today. So I hope everybody can still hear me well. My name is Kurt Dreisilker. I'm the head of Natural Resources and Collections Horticulture here at the Morton Arboretum, which is where we are beaming live from the snowy grounds of the Arboretum. So today, what I want to talk about is, what I want to focus on is the title here is Becoming Sentinels Against Invasive Plants, rolling out guidelines to help develop your garden's plant list. This is webinar number 1 of 2, as I indicated in my email that I sent out about a week ago. Before we get into the meat of the content, I just want to cover a couple of logistical matters. First of all, that I've intentionally muted everybody so that we can just keep on rolling through the content. We will plan to have some time for questions and answers at the end of our presentation, and so that will give us some time to dialogue. But if you have questions during the seminar, please do use the chat box, which is in the menu bar of Zoom. So you can find that there. People are using it already, so sounds good. The presentation today is being recorded, so if folks want to listen to the presentation later, we can make that available to you as well. All right, so just to start off here, as I mentioned, you're hearing from me, Kurt Dreisilker, and you'll also hear in a little while from Claire Ryan, the program coordinator for Midwest Invasive Plants Network, where she is based out of the Arboretum, and we are two presenters for today, and we're part of the working group that will focus on this initiative that we're calling Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants. So really, Claire and I are just here representing the work of a number of people who have come together for the past couple of years to bring this initiative to you today. So we're very excited to share with you the results and kind of the current updates of where we are. You can see the logos of many of the organizations who have been contributing to this. We have some of the working group members on the webinar today, so hello everybody. Teresa Cully from the University of Cincinnati, Nadia Kavelin from Rowe Botanic Gardens, Hans Landell from Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center, Roger Gettig from the Holden Arboretum, Brittany Schultz from Missouri Botanical Gardens, and Jessica Schuler from New York Botanic Gardens. And I also want to point out that the funding for this initiative has come from the North Central IPM Center, funded through the United States Department of Agriculture. So we're very grateful for all of the contributions of the group. Claire and I are just here today to share out the results of what we're up to. So we're very excited about this. We've been working on this for a couple of years. This initiative has been underway for a little while now. The working group has been meeting monthly for about 2 years now. We've been gathering and synthesizing feedback from gardens and curators from across the continent, from across the United States and Canada, and building that feedback into what we've developed and what we're sharing with you today and in 3 weeks' time. So we're very excited about this. As mentioned, we have 2 webinars. We have so much to say that we're going to roll this out in 2 different webinars. So today, obviously, we're going to focus on rolling out the guidelines to develop your garden's plant list. In 3 weeks from now, we will plan to share with you the database that we will unveil and we will use to collect information about what's happening at different gardens across the continent. We strategically split these 2 in time so that 3 weeks separate the 2, because we want to ask your help for building a list from your own gardens in the 3-week period here. So we're going to ask, as you go away from today's webinar, to start thinking about and applying these guidelines to what's happening within your own garden, and then to start building your list. We'll send out some more information after the webinar today, so you'll have more in your inbox, hopefully by the end of today. But since this content has been fairly complex, at first it might seem like an easy thing to do to build an invasive species list or just a species list of plants escaping from cultivation. But under the surface, it becomes really complex and pretty quickly. And so what we're offering up here is another webinar on February 4th at the same time, 12 p.m. Central, where we'll have kind of a loose structure, just open dialogue, we're calling it an office hours. And this will be just for you to spend some time in the guidelines and looking through things and thinking about how it applies to your garden. And then we anticipate questions, so we're going to open up this time as an office hour to engage that conversation. So hopefully you have your questions answered prior to the database webinar in 3 weeks. So we're excited about that. So starting from the top here, we have the purpose of our effort is really to document the spread of cultivated plants from within botanic gardens and arboreta. And this focused area is really across North America. We recognize that public gardens have many different plant taxa within their collections and gardens. Many of them are newly imported or introduced into the gardens, and some of which are popular in the horticulture trade, but others are not and may be more obscure. So we want to track and document the spread of cultivated plants from within these gardens. We also want to utilize gardens' observations, their expertise, and standardized data to help stop problematic species from becoming invasive. We want to also do this, sort of extending that effort by engaging our professional networks to steer development away from problematic taxa. And finally, we want to create a network of gardens to share information about plant species escaping from cultivation. And we have collected some data to support these three purposes, these 3 bullet points here. The basic concept behind what we're after here, what we're up to, is just to reference this invasive species, or the invasion curve here. Many of us are probably familiar with the invasion curve as basically as time moves along, a plant population can increase and occupy larger and larger areas, which then increases the control costs. So as you move from left to right in this graph, you can see that the population increases, and oftentimes when we're controlling invasive species, we are focusing mainly on the right-hand side of this graph. But the effort that this initiative is aiming for is really upending that and focusing on the left side of the curve, where prevention and eradication is more of the norm. And so you can see that by the time plant species are introduced into our gardens, perhaps, they might spread from cultivation, where we have a small number of localized populations within our gardens or even immediately surrounding our gardens, and eradication is quite possible. So this is really the essence of what we're after, trying to get ahead of the curve and trying to prevent plant species from becoming invasive. We know already that horticulture is a major pathway of invasive plant introductions. Sarah Reichert published a paper in 1994 showing that 82% of the 235 woody plant species escaping cultivation in the United States were already in landscaping. Many gardens have grown these taxa. It's not unfamiliar to us here at Morton, for example, but some gardens are actually still perhaps growing some of these invasive taxa. But when plants escape from cultivation within our public gardens, we'd like to encourage gardens to share this information, to take action, rather than sweeping it under the rug and kind of ignoring the information. In doing this, gardens should be thinking of themselves as leaders with expertise on the plant collections that they maintain, and really not being afraid of releasing this information or even of being blamed for contributing to plant invasions. This is an essential component to helping to demonstrate that gardens are really leaders in the plant collections and have a lot of knowledge to share about what's going on within their collections and on their properties. We know that this is happening. We did a survey a couple of years ago with public gardens across the continent, and we simply asked, and 91.5% of the responding gardens have actually observed plants escaping from cultivation. 86% of the responding gardens have seen plant movement as a problem. They interpret this as a problem. And about 2/3 of the respondents have collections policies that actually address plant invasiveness in some way. So this is promising, actually. This demonstrates that gardens are actually working on the issue. They're incorporating policy, developing and incorporating policies into their operations, and but actually perhaps working independently on the issue within their own gardens alone. 88% say they could benefit from sharing information on plant movement or plant invasiveness with other gardens. And this is a key issue. As I mentioned, it appears that most gardens are actually working independently on this and not sharing the information, unless it's at perhaps meetings when we bump into each other from time to time in person. Despite all this, no formal platform actually exists in order to do this. And so this is, these results here share some of the information that we've been able to collect over the past couple of years at different functions, such as American Public Gardens Association meetings with an audience of people much like you, curators and plant recorders and horticulturists and specialists from within the garden sector. We've gotten our feedback directly from you, and so you are really our primary audience for the moment. If you'd like to read a little bit more about this effort, some of these numbers that I've included on the slide here well, all of the numbers are included in this publication that was published earlier in 2019. The Public Garden magazine released an article that we put together sharing a fuller version of this story here. So please do take a look at that if you're interested. So the context for our initiative here is really, well, we're not the first to think about this. This issue has been underway for a while. We've just bullet pointed here a couple of people and organizations that are already considering this and have thought about this. Dating back to the 1990s, Fran Hardy published a paper when he was working with the then Illinois Department of Conservation about horticultural plant species that are escaping and found in natural areas within Illinois. Glenn Dreyer also published, he actually presented the topic at an American Public Garden Association conference back when it was AABGA. But these are just two examples of people who have, voiced their concern about the topic, but undoubtedly there are more also. Then in 2001, the St. Louis Declaration was developed in Missouri Botanical Garden. A group of people gathered to focus on this issue, developing the voluntary codes of conduct for various sectors. including one specifically for botanic gardens. And so I'm sure that many folks out there are aware of this and may have even contributed to this effort as well. About a little over 10 years later, the European Code of Conduct was produced and is available. And just a couple of years ago, in 2016, the North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Plant Conservation highlighted this issue as well. So all of this really gives rise to what we're doing now. But just to dig into a couple of those organizations or those initiatives a little bit more, the St. Louis Declaration's voluntary codes of conduct really focused and called for some key steps here, which I'd like to just elaborate on a little bit more, or at least list here. They called for avoiding introducing invasive plants by establishing an invasive plant assessment procedure, including risk assessments, and calling for the responsible monitoring of the garden site itself. They call for consideration of removing invasive species from the plant collections, controlling them within the natural areas, and participation in early warning systems for reporting and control. They call also for participation in the creation of regional lists of concern. And the last bullet point that I want to point out here is that gardens should become informed about invasiveness of their species in other regions. And this information should be compiled and shared in a manner accessible to all. So many folks here are probably, I suspect, engaged in at least some of these bullet points within their own gardens. And so may be familiar with these initiatives and this effort. But I suspect many people are doing this within their own gardens and not really contributing to a network of botanic gardens across the continent to develop this. So I guess what I want to also point out is that the St. Louis Declaration's Code of Conduct really point out what to do, but not necessarily how to do it in all cases. And so this is really where our initiative picks up from some of these bullet points here. The North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Plant Conservation also highlights that botanic gardens will increase their roles in management and control of invasive species, as well as adopting relevant strategies. But it is also just left in kind of that general sense without providing specific guidelines. And so this is really the context in which we find ourselves now. We're picking up these documents and these initiatives that a lot of other people have called upon the garden sector to move forth. And this is exactly what we aim to do, is to put some substance into some of these strategies that are called for. So back in November of 2016, this group of folks met for 2 days at the Morton Arboretum for a garden summit called Plants on the Move. And Plants on the Move was hosted, it was a 2-day summit with presentations and workshops, really to characterize the current state of affairs among botanic gardens across North America concerning plants escaping from cultivation within their individual gardens. And out of these 2 days, we produced some key findings. Here's a document with the summary and key findings from the Plants on the Move. Some of the main points include that plants escaping from cultivation really is an important issue that gardens should be doing something about, should be discussing and developing solutions for. We should also not hesitate to openly discuss plants that are actually escaping from cultivation within our gardens. We should, a key finding was that escaping cultivation and invasiveness are not the same. And so there was some sensitivity to that, and for good reason. And a key finding was that a platform is needed for gardens to contribute and share observations when plants escape cultivation. And the idea that was initially put forth was that gardens should have an environment to contribute their information in a manner that would help to facilitate other gardens to contribute their own information as well within a relatively sort of a closed environment, which I'll get into in a little bit. But it was also thought to point out that it was really important to garner input from more gardens throughout the process. So we recognized that during the two-day event or the summit at the Morton Arboretum, only a select few gardens from the entire continent really could attend, and that some feedback might be missing after even those 2 days. So we wanted to make sure that we garnered the input from other gardens and incorporated it as we could throughout the process. We don't mean to exclude other gardens in this process, in other words. And so as a result of the two-day summit, a smaller group convened and became a working group to move forward on some of the issues that were called for in the key findings. And so as the working group convened, we discovered that while gardens are often doing great work individually concerning invasive species, there's actually a lack of alignment on methods across gardens. And so what we found is that the working group, we sort of all contributed our own invasive plant lists, or what we might think of as a naughty plant list. And everybody's doing this sort of thing in a different manner. So there's really no standard process. And so making comparisons across gardens is really quite challenging when this is happening. And so we realized that a standard approach was needed. But at the end of that effort, we compiled lists from 7 different gardens and ended up with 778 species on the list. And you can see just a couple of images at the bottom as well. So I think this really just demonstrates that this initiative it offers a lot of potential to help fill the gaps in information when other people may want to do plant assessments, risk assessments, and find out information about rather obscure plants that may not be widely known to be problematic. And so we developed a standardized list that I'm actually going to turn the mic over to Claire Ryan, as she will actually go into more detail about what the standardized list is and how you might be able to contribute as well. So Claire, I'll turn it over to you at the moment here, and hopefully everybody can hear you as well.
Thanks, Kurt. And would I just use the mouse to click through slides? Okay, great. So just to address a question that came in through the chat box really quickly, whether we would have some documentation available, because this is a really densely packed amount of information that we're trying to get in a short amount of time. And the answer is yes. And we will be sending you that later today. So don't feel like you have to furiously take notes and capture everything we're saying, because you will have it in hand. Oops. There we go. Okay, I'll keep my finger off of that scroll thing. So as Kurt mentioned, our goal for the Public Gardens Sentinels working group was to try and develop a standardized methodology that gardens can use to list and categorize plants from collections that have been observed escaping cultivation. We kind of hinted at this earlier, but it's not exactly the same as an invasive plant list, because gardens might be including taxa on these lists that don't really meet that threshold of being invasive. They're seeing some spread potential there, but they may not be in the flora, they may not have been assessed, they may not be on the radar of invasive plant groups, and that's a key difference. I will say that this methodology too is intended to be primarily observation-based. It's intended to be fairly straightforward and simple, using information that gardens should be readily able to collect just in the process of maintaining their collections and maintaining their grounds. And hopefully we hit the mark there.
Thanks for the mouse over here.
Can't see the mouse. Okay. So the first step in doing this work is honestly, it's just to generate a raw list of all the non-native taxa that you've observed on your site spreading beyond location of cultivation. And this may take a variety of forms. You might see things spreading by seed. It might just be vegetative spread relatively local to where the collections plant is located. It could include any size of spontaneous population too, from something in the dozens to something in the thousands. It could be nearby or distant from the site of cultivation, and it could be occurring spontaneously in other cultivated areas, such as an adjacent plant bed, or in uncultivated areas. And the reason why this raw list is going to have such a diversity of presentations is that we're going to rank it to assess sort of the invasiveness or not. This is obviously step 2. To categorize the list into these categories we have listed here: watch list, potentially invasive, actually invasive, and assessed as invasive. And this based on a literature review. And that seems like splitting hairs, but was pretty important for our process, and I'll describe it as we go here. So the key considerations here, and I kind of mentioned this already, but how you sort and categorize these plants is going to be primarily based on your observations at the garden. The data parameters we looked at most in terms of doing this are the population size, its distribution, which includes the distance, its spreading, and perhaps the number of different populations you have on site, and then the management context at the locations where it's spreading. Or is it really only seemingly able to establish in managed areas or in areas where soil is disturbed, or is it starting to pop up in sort of more naturalized areas? And we do want to stress too that use of professional judgment is going to be important here. We offer some example thresholds of what might be considered a smaller population versus a larger population, but it has to be kind of in the context of judgment. Is not a hard and fast rules. We just don't think that would work too well for everyone. Another thing to mention too is that this categorization it's based on your observations at the garden. It should be done in context of what's going on in the region too, in terms of whether the plants are present in the regional flora. So it does require some knowledge of what's going on around you, but as plants people, we think that shouldn't be too much of a reach for gardens. And we do want to highlight too that because this is a Sentinel effort, in terms of collecting and sharing data, we think the most interesting things are going to fall out in this watch list and in the potentially invasive categories. So this is kind of the opposite of how you see most invasive plant lists presented. You always see the worst things at the top of those. And we're thinking our primary area of interest are in these actually the least known categories, because for the most part, natural areas managers already have a pretty good handle on what's invasive. It's the lesser known stuff that's going to be important. Okay. So our first category is this watch list, and the classic example of what this would be is actually this top line here. So a watch list species is going to be just really starting to spread where you're seeing not a large population. So, and we define that as less than 100 individuals or stems, but that's not intended to be a hard and fast number. So if you have 101 or 105, And in fact, we don't actually expect you to count them one by one either. It's really an order of magnitude kind of thing. And then the distance of spread, you see a variety of things, but the most classic example is going to be just starting to spread close to the origin in the collection. And primarily, at least at the beginning, is going to be only seen in cultivated areas. So, for example, in adjacent beds, or perhaps spreading into turf grass, but not so much in uncultivated areas. And we define this as well, this term uncultivated area in the guidelines. You might be like, what is that? Obviously, if you have natural areas, that would be an uncultivated area. If you don't, though, it might be hedgerows or compost areas or maintenance areas of the garden that aren't managed as part of the collection. And this part is important too. Generally, if it's going in the watch list, it shouldn't be known to occur in the regional flora. So, it shouldn't be naturalized already. And that's when we kind of recommended this watch list rank. And you can see too, these are by and large small populations, by and large not occurring in uncultivated areas. And if they are, it shouldn't be frequently. So what we recommend, policies for plants going in this category. And again, these are recommendations. We're not forcing anyone to do anything, but it really helps to document new or expanding populations of things that are moving around in local herbariums, especially if such records aren't already there. And then, as the word watch list implies, it's pretty important to monitor these species for any changes in behavior and spread. And it may be important to train staff and volunteers to identify these species, particularly at the seedling stage, which can be tricky, as we know. Be judicious about promoting or selling these species if you have a plant sale or exchange or anything like that. And to revisit the status pretty frequently. We recommend annually, perhaps biannually if that's not reachable, and then re-rank if more aggressive behavior is being seen. The potentially invasive category, so this is kind of the middle one that falls between the two extremes of the watch list, which I just described, and invasive. But here, you do see kind of a variety of behavior, but in general, you're starting to see somewhat larger populations. Again, order of magnitude, looking at maybe hundreds instead of less than 100. You may start to see it spreading further from the collections and more readily in uncultivated areas. You have a mix here of whether or not it's going to be part of the flora. In cases where it's not, but you're seeing this aggressive spread of the garden, that's kind of when it ends up in potentially invasive territory. So you're seeing a large influx of seedlings. And when it is part of the regional flora, so it's naturalized elsewhere, you would only really consider it potentially invasive if you're not seeing very aggressive spread of the garden. So really small populations in closer proximity. And our recommended policies for these types of plants are to document any newer expanding populations as needed in the herbaria, to come up with a deaccession plan for individuals in the collection with an implementation time frame, and eradicate the spontaneous population on your property, or to at least attempt to. Could be tough, I know. This one is interesting. So if it's really spreading from the garden, and there's a good possibility it's hopped the fence onto other properties. And again, it's not widely abundant already in the naturalized flora. It might be a good idea to notify the garden property neighbors and help them be able to identify and remove it to again kind of stave off an invasion. We would recommend that people don't promote these, distribute or sell them in any way, and actively discourage their use. And a good way to do that even the green industry can often get behind, is to suggest alternatives on the landscape that share some of the characteristics that people might enjoy in those plants. And then the invasive category. These are, by and large, already known to be invasive because they're part of the flora of the region of the garden. They've probably been assessed by invasive plant groups or perhaps state government even, and are generally on the radar and known to be invasive. And for the purposes of this project, as I mentioned before, these are kind of the things we're least interested in. So we know they're invasive. And you see these, you're going to see large populations if you have them on your collection. They're going to be spreading pretty readily, pretty far. You probably won't actually be able to know whether seedlings arriving or appearing on your property are from collections plants if you have them, or if they're general seed rain from the surrounding area. And they will appear in uncultivated areas pretty readily. And the policies here are pretty similar for the potentially invasive, though we do recommend a fully implemented deaccession plan. You know, these are invasive plants. You don't really want to have them as part of your collection. You will control the spontaneous population on your property, recognizing that full eradication may be unlikely, because you might be looking at something like this, where you've got an incredibly dense population that is going to take a lot of time and resources to manage. Again, not promoting, distributing, selling, and we recommend, to the extent you can, actively educating about known invasive species, and again, suggesting alternatives. And then I mentioned before, we haven't assessed as invasive category, and this was so as not to exclude gardens that are honestly ahead of the curve and have done some predictive risk assessment. And we had a garden doing this, participating in our working group as well. And this category is for when a garden has determined a taxa to be invasive, really based on factors other than their direct experience or primary observation with that plant. A lot of times this might be through a formal risk assessment process or a literature review, but it's something documented that says we think this is invasive because of this documentation. There are other data parameters that are very, very helpful, and we have included in our database. So after a garden goes through this raw listing and ranking process, they're going to have essentially a list of species names and ranks. And that's kind of along with the user data about where the garden is located, that's going to be the bare minimum of information we need to be able to share to tell a story and to kind of share with each other what's going on. However, there are other considerations and data parameters here that we would recommend if you have the capacity to think about these and start recording them as well. So for the spontaneous populations of these plants spreading from cultivation, the population size, distribution, again, if you know where they're coming from, how far are they going, the context as the management regime in place at the location these plants are popping up, the time frame over which they've been observed, their age, and there might be different ages depending how long it's been there. Health, are they growing very vigorously? Are they looking not so great, and then even associated plants. So what else is popping up in these areas? Collections is helpful to know how many of these taxa or of each species are in the collections, the age, and kind of just the history, how long has it been there, of the collection specimens, and then cultivar information. If you have several cultivars, is there one that appears to be contributing more to spontaneous populations than others? That's really important information, and somewhere where the garden community could really improve the state of knowledge. And then it may also be helpful for gardens to be able to share with each other what's working in terms of managing those spontaneous populations, in terms of the methods, again, the time frame over which management has taken place, how manageable they are using those methods, and then collections policy decisions. I think it would be, it's really interesting to see when gardens have decided to deaccession some of these taxa based on their movement. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the database today because we have a whole hour dedicated to it in a few weeks. But as Kurt mentioned, this online database is by public gardens for gardens, and it'll be access controlled. It's actually on collections management software, and it's going to be used to allow gardens to share their observation-based lists with each other, and also query records from other gardens. So, I mean, that's what Kurt has said to me so many times, is when he sees something popping up that's unusual, it's not been seen before spreading, he's always thinking, I wonder if my peers at this garden and that garden see that, and this will give gardens a way to access that information without necessarily saying, these species are all invasive. Some of them may just be starting to spread. And we will be developing, though, periodic summary reports for external audiences. And this is really an important part of the effort, too, because if what gardens are seeing as we start to amass data only stays in this closed loop, is kind of limited utility in terms of stopping introduction into green industry of potentially problematic species. So that's our goal, is to use the database to kind of summarize and get information out beyond just the gardens. And it will be, actually, as the guidelines have been, it will be an iterative development. We're open to feedback of all sorts, so tune into that. So next steps, as Kurt mentioned, our dearest hope is that you will use the guidelines to make and characterize a draft list of taxa escaping cultivation. We mentioned before, we're going to have some open time to help answer questions and just think through this. We'd also be very grateful for feedback on the webinar today and on the guidelines once you have a chance to actually dig into those. And we're going to send, when we send the guidelines, we're going to send links to simple forms that you can use to do that. They're pretty straightforward. So our next webinar is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. And the other upcoming event, just in case you're planning to attend the APGA annual conference, we're going to have a workshop on this project and on the kind of list making and characterizing and sharing process. So that's in Portland, Oregon in June. So just FYI. And I think we do want to thank the team again. And that's our contact information if you want to email us specific questions. But I think our hope now was to kind of open it up and just get some immediate questions and
Yeah, so
dialogue.
thank you, Claire. If you want to, I'll leave the contact information up there. But if you have a chance and you have a question, it would be great to use the chat box in Zoom to text your question into us, and we can do our best to answer those questions as they come in. I'm just going to also just elaborate on one point here. As Claire was finishing up, she was talking about the database and the guidelines and getting feedback. What we're trying to do is really facilitate conversation and coaching gardens through this process, because we recognize that gardens are at different points within kind of their own operations in regards to collecting this information and doing anything about it. And so, so this process is really that. It's a process that we want to, you know, engage in that conversation. So even if you don't have questions today, then it would be great to, you know, contact and stay in touch with you after this effort here. Okay, so Hans asked the question, how will we get the documents? And so we will be sending out an email following up this webinar, so it'll come out today, with these documents attached to them. And so the guidelines themselves will be as part of that email, as well as the forms allowing you to provide feedback on this whole effort as well. Okay, so Jamie is asking, are any state exotic plant pest councils aware of this network and how it complements their work? And I might just say that I suspect that as the effort is unraveling now, as we're building this and getting it off the ground, I suspect some of them may be, but we've not really specifically been engaging in conversations with any sort of councils or really any other sectors, you know, propagation societies or anyone else. But that is certainly a main avenue of this information, to get this information out into the hands of other sectors. So we do not aim to keep this information within the public garden sector. I think it will be the most valuable and contribute the most to the cause by sending this information out. And so right now, most of our conversations have really been exclusively within the garden sector. And so as part of our next steps in our work plan is really to engage those other audiences to start to figure out how we can get that information out to them, how to engage that conversation, and make it as useful as possible.
A follow-up comment there was, is the hope of the network to have state councils have gardens as a part of their evaluations in the future. Those category 2 and 3 lists are really subjective in some states. So I agree. You see a variety of information in those evaluations, and sometimes I think in the best cases, and you know, I know Teresa works on some of these evaluations in Ohio, is when you don't have enough data to support a ranking, to be honest about that, and to either set the whole evaluation process aside or to at least acknowledge that the conclusions are based on limited information. And yes, we are definitely hoping that this project will provide some more data about these plants moving around in various regions of the country to support better kind of paper-based risk assessments done by exotic plant councils. And they would definitely, I mean, MIPIN is essentially a regional exotic plant council, and we're tied into the national network of councils. So we would definitely be sharing. I mentioned these kind of synthesis reports from the database. We'd definitely be sharing that pretty widely with exotic plant councils.
Okay, Richard points out that the Missouri Botanic Garden Declaration recommends removal of identified invasive species. How will persons tasked with identifying such plants outside of the garden be able to ID them if they can't see a live specimen? Drones are being used in natural areas, and they need live plants to calibrate the sensors. Can't the gardens maintain a standard specimen? And so that's a good point here. So the ability of the garden to leave a specimen in place is, we have recommendations on how to handle those collections issues. In many cases, as the plant population builds, we would make the recommendation to remove it from the collection, but this is a recommendation. Gardens would have the option to maintain a standard specimen. But we also recognize that there might be other ways to enable a person to help identify that plant species. So one of the ways would be to maintain an herbarium specimen. And so we have, it's certainly not a live specimen, but it would be a dead specimen maintained properly through the herbarium vouchering process. And so that is a key component of this as well. I really can't comment on the ability of drones. If there's evolving technology that would be useful for this purpose, we would need to consider that as well. But I really can't comment too much more about the issue of drones. Okay, so Sandra is also asking a question here. How are you disposing of the invasive plants that are removed? We're tackling that issue at the Toronto Botanical Garden. How are we disposing of them? So at Morton, what we're doing is we're deaccessioning them by cutting them down, digging out the stumps, using herbicide, composting them. I mean, a number of different manner of removal mechanisms in order to make sure that the invasive plants are removed. If these plants have a wide population and are found quite readily in the regional flora, then standard disposal mechanisms would probably be fine for something like that. But if we have other plant taxa that are not found in the region, and we may not want to, just remove them through our traditional means, we might need to compost them specifically. If it's, I'm just thinking here, if it's an aquatic species, we don't want to let it sit anywhere near waterways. We want to let it decompose to its fullest. I mean, we don't really have a standard way of disposing them, I guess, is my main point. But we would have to use special sensitivity about how the species is, how widely spread it is in the region, and its dispersal mechanism. So we don't want to contribute to the continued population if it is a sensitive species in that regard. That's a good point, though, and probably one that we might want to focus a little bit more on if there are issues. So Sandra, that's a good point. I think it'd be interesting to follow up with you a little bit about that maybe after this. So the public has been advised to put in the landfill stream here as you comment. Yeah, please do email me. That would be an interesting comment or issue to follow up on.
Yeah, and it's something that's MIPIN is looking at. Among invasive plant managers, because jurisdictions do have all sorts of different recommendations. Like Minnesota, for example, here, landfilling of organic material is explicitly not allowed. So they have to find different ways of doing it, and they have certified compost facilities, and all this stuff is professional opinion, I guess, is that if it's known to be fruiting and seeding around, it's safest always to dispose on site if you can, if that's compatible with your site goals. And there are different ways to do that, kind of brush piling, burning, are a couple common ways. But yeah, spreading seeds, no good.
So we have another question about accessing the database. So we'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but in order to access the database, a public garden does not necessarily need to be an institutional member of APGA at this point, but it will be login and password protected. So it would be a rather simple, straightforward process of enrolling in that regard within the database itself, and then accessing the database. The database itself will be housed at Morton, and as Claire mentioned, it's really a kind of a collections management type of database, and so that's we're providing an online platform for that so that we can collect all this information. But at this point, no, it's not restricted to any particular membership in APGA.
Just a couple comments. We missed one above. There it is. Sylvan mentioned it would be interesting to run watch list plants coming into the database through a formal weed risk assessment process that could then be shared among gardens. I agree. There is a certain amount of regional sensitivity, like climate sensitivity to those. So I think you could have a weed risk assessment done that would apply generally to a region, but you're not necessarily going to see the same behavior in, say, the Northeast and the arid areas of the country, just based on climate. But in general, better sharing of assessments is going to help all of us. And okay, next comment was I'd love to see a resource or forum for invasive species best practices. We've tried several different practices in Akron, but we want to make sure we're handling it properly. MIPIN is actually, we're working on doing just that, like a pretty comprehensive resource for best practices, but it is specific to woody taxa.
And as Hans points out in the text chat there, best management practices is probably beyond the scope of the project as well. What we're trying to do is really focus on identifying the plants that are actually escaping cultivation. Management of those species that are considered more obscure might be an interesting topic to build into in the future, but I couldn't speak for the group, the working group at the moment to say that we could include that at the moment here. But that might shed some interesting light on how to prevent these species from becoming invasive, no doubt. So thank you, Hans, for adding to that as well. So I also note that it's at the hour mark, so I think we'll have to wrap it up here. So I just want to finish off by saying thank you so much to everybody for joining today. If you have more questions, please do feel free to email both Claire and myself. Our email addresses are still posted up here on the screen. We're happy to continue the dialogue, but otherwise we will plan to meet again on February 4th for the workshop, and then again for the database webinar on February 12th. So thank you everybody for joining us.